right. Well, thank you. I feel so lucky to be asked to be part of this panel with all these amazing colleagues, and I hope I can entertain you at the end of the day here. A lot of what I'm going to be speaking about right now is also this sort of generational shift in our relationship to Motherwell that John expressed really beautifully, David expressed. I want to start, though, by talking about his sort of position as a kind of public intellectual around art and this notion of the person who sort of assumes the position of explaining the avant-garde at that time. And in that, I find him extremely interesting. I was watching the film called Storming the Citadel, is that what it was? And it was like kind of amazing, because if someone spoke that way today, they would be like, you know, it was like this kind of extremely, I know everything, you know, and I'm going to tell you everything. And so it was like, wow, this is such a major shift in how we both present ideas and how we present what, in a sense, and I think Motherwell would agree with this, is an act of being a very curious person. I mean, that's how I see his writing. And I also write a lot. So this idea of using writing and knowing that it's a form that can never, it sort of dances around painting. It's not really adequate to visual art. And sort of following your own curiosity as an artist and as a maker to learn about other people and use language as a way of sort of giving access. In my own practice, I've written a lot about feminist artists from the 70s in an effort to sort of open up the practice and think about it differently today. So this is the first thing I wanted to say about him. The other thing that I find interesting about him is, sorry, I haven't found the right place. I'm of the same generation as John, and Motherwell, for me as a kid, always wanting to be an artist, represented this kind of class aspiration that was buried in abstract expressionism, right? It's like once you reach the upper classes, you will make paintings that have very little on them. They will be very elegant. They will be all about description, you know. They will all be this kind of moment, right? And listening to the interview with him that's in the archives, where he talks very vigorously about hating the fact that people assumed he was wealthy, or I don't know how true that was, but I mean, it felt very like, it was something very prickly about the assumptions about his class status. This sort of schizophrenic relationship that artists have with class is a really important part of being an American artist, especially now when the art market is so crazy and it's all about, you know, who got what at auction. So just to begin, those are my first thoughts. I also teach at Hunter College. And so my colleague, Howard Singerman, who is our chair, recently did a show on Motherwell's his influence on the art department at Hunter, which was extremely interesting. And I think Jack or somebody mentioned the fact that the woman who ran the department, whose name I'm blanking out on, asked Alfred Barr to suggest an artist, a modern artist, to bring in and change up the what had been basically an applied arts program. Hunter was a women's college at the time. And so Motherwell brought in a lot of his colleagues, Baziotes, Fritz Bultmann, Richard Lippold, a couple of other people whose names I can't remember. But I was just reading his statement about the mission of the department, and he talks about helping students cultivate their own subjectivity, which seems pretty radical given the fact that most of his students were women. And it totally goes against my own sort of things I thought about Motherwell, actually, throughout my own upbringing around art and, what abstract expressionism could mean to a young female artist at the end of the 20th century, all that stuff. So to further that idea, I want to read you a little something that Amy Silman wrote, another contemporary of ours, about abstract expressionism. Just hold on a second. So this is something that Amy wrote at a couple years ago that was published in Art Forum that was called Disco Balls, or Abex and Disco Balls, in Defense of Abstract Expressionism. I feel kind of bad for Abex. At 60-something, the old bird's gotten the gimlet eye from just about everybody. It's vulgar, it's phallocracy, it's nothing but an empty trophy. It celebrates bourgeois subjectivity, it's a Cold War CIA front, and basically expressionism's really embarrassing. A dandy wouldn't be caught dead doing something as earnest as struggling or channeling jazz with his arms. An old-style dandy, at least. T.J. Clark's 1994 text in the defense of abstract expressionism made Abex's connection to the vulgar perfectly clear, rendering it pathetic in all its ridiculous glory. But his writing touches only briefly on one of the most important aspects of this vulgarity, the fact that it is gendered. It's precisely the gender vicissitudes of Abex that I'd like to examine here. And I draw the dotted line back to 1964, when Sontag mined this territory in her notes on camp, declaring the old-style dandy hated vulgarity. The new-style dandy, the lover of camp, appreciates vulgarity. And so she goes on in the article, and it's definitely worth reading, to talk about how the notion of abstract expressionism, which for my generation was somewhat evacuated of content, basically. It's like, this idea of somebody having a kind of signature mark seems ridiculous to someone who grew up in postmodernism. How we've all sort of find ourselves sort of gravitating back to some of the ideas and picking and choosing at various ones. So I'm typically known for thinking a lot about color field painting in my work and thinking about Frankenthaler, and have been very interested in this resurrection that we've been having lately of Frankenthaler and her reputation. And Katie Siegel has been a big part of that. She's one of my colleagues at Hunter. So for me, when I started really developing this body of work, I was thinking a lot about how to make work that didn't rely on this notion of a gesture. So color field painting was a sort of obvious location. And it was also an interesting location because when I came up as an artist, this kind of painting seemed so, like office building decoration kind of painting. Like, that's how I would have thought about it. But in order to get away from the burden of having to invent or find this signature way of painting, I turned to acrylic paint, which seemed like a way out, right? It was something that was sort of disregarded, disused, or, it's the stepsister of oil paint. So I was looking a lot at color field painting, Morris Louis, and this last couple of weeks, as I've been doing research for this talk and research on Motherwell and thinking about his relationship to collage and my own sort of triangulation of ideas around late modernism, it suddenly occurred to me, this is a very late collage, but generally this idea of collage turning into this sort of language that both facilitated pop art and sort of modernist design in the 60s, which is something that's been part of the concern of my work for a long time. So I also have a history as a graphic designer. So the interest in like where painting and design meet, where this idea of public, private, gallery, billboard, design used as a vehicle for political content, Sister Corita Kent, design used as, this is Paul Rand, who was, famous for designing the IBM logo, but this is his anti-war poster, which is so elegant. It's like, this would not prevent a war from happening. It's really pretty, though. Maybe it would be in your parents' house. You know what I mean? You had that. Yeah. So this, the fact that Motherwell becomes this kind of public intellectual represented by collage and, sort of bringing these ideas to America and it becoming a kind of household sign for class aspiration, I find very interesting. I guess the thing I want to focus on for a little while is just sort of pulling apart parts of Motherwell's practice that I think maybe unknowingly responded to because he's such an iconic figure. And as I've been doing this research, it's like, okay, I get that. So gender. I guess we need Deb Cass. I should have put Deb Cass's painting in here, actually. That would have been like the direct. So the notion of how this most celebrated part of American painting, this most celebrated history that we're all, as American painters of the 21st century, having to respond to in a way. I don't know, I don't think my students would think that, but I certainly feel that way, is this thing that sort of, it's always this back and forth conversation. And when I was younger, the idea of abstract expressionism being an extremely masculinist form was extremely off-putting. It was like, well, how do I deal with this? What do I do about it? And so I think in my own way, over the last 15 or 20 years, I've sort of developed a kind of language that both uses some of the graphic and bold, almost symbolic content of some of the abstract expressionists, Motherwell in particular, and then uses things that could be, in a very essentialist way, talked about as female, like pouring. So these kinds of process-oriented gestures, when John talked about the flatness of the elegy for the Spanish Republic and this idea that the balls of the bull or Guernica or whatever, the Minotaur, are these flat things that are constantly sort of pushing at you when you see these paintings, and they look incredible when they're reproduced. They're like the perfect JPEG. So it's like, how do you respond to this idea that's like this kind of icon of masculinity around painting, So these are some of the paintings that, this painting is 72 inches square, and my process involves a lot of collage in terms of the aesthetic. Sometimes I start from collages. Also, at this point in the work, the paintings are painted on raw canvas. So there's a kind of dialogue that goes back and forth between graphic design and pouring. It's a detail. The other thing that I was very interested in for a while, this is a couple of years old, but this idea of illusionistic abstraction, which I think is funny given David's talk, because, this idea that Motherwell would paint out the fake, oil spill or this idea of having a genuine automatic mark or intuition is exactly the thing I've been suspicious of my entire life. So, but at the same time, it's incredibly fun to think that you're painting that way. So it's like this back and forth, in my work, a sort of intellectualized dance around ideas about spontaneity, about the unconscious. Another set of penises. So let me just check my notes here. I'm bad at, I need visuals. Oh, the only thing I wrote was collage, so that wasn't too deep. The other thing that I've been finding really fascinating, and it's like this man, Robert Motherwell, has formed a kind of bedrock in my my education as an artist. This, part of the things that he writes about the notion of abstraction always coming from something, or this idea of figuration that keeps appearing in his work, even though we're meant to read it as a kind of abstraction, is something that is still, even though presumably it's been like solved, for me it continues to be something I'm very interested in. So the work that I'm showing you right now came from a period where I was trying to figure out an abstract language that recalled a set of figures. And this is how I use collage. They're black and white. This one is kind of jazzy because it was in a magazine. But basically they're black and white collages that are about this big, that I use as a kind of structure to pour things on. Perhaps similar to what John was talking about, where he uses the top of the stretcher as this sort of hanging device or something. The other thing that I've been thinking about as I've looked at his work is his sense of color, which is very peculiar. On the one hand, it's extremely graphic and it looks amazing in black and white. On the other hand, it uses, as David Batchelor would say in Chromophobia, this idea of, ochres or colors that are native to oil paint only, that live in that realm. Even though, on the other hand, we'll have these bright reds or these, things that seem like they could have been printed. So it's this funny language, and perhaps it, comes out in someone like Rauschenberg, where it's like the world of art and the world of the street or outside or the market seems to live in the same picture, which of course is part of where the collage comes from. I always sort of slow down when I start showing my own pictures and forget what I want to say. The surrealism, can we just get that out of the way? Surrealism continues to be incredibly important. And it's so funny to think of Motherwell as being part of this lineage, because it's, to me, that's where the sort of intellectual part comes from. It's like when you see the work and you think of automatism, I guess because I'm not French and I didn't grow up in that culture, it's like, it doesn't necessarily look like automatism to me. It looks like the pure joy of painting. It's not that you're tapping in, it's more about the physical body. And that's the part that interests me in Motherwell. It's like, perhaps it is the brain being erased or something, but increasingly in my own work, I've gotten interested in the notion of movement. I started out as a modern dancer. again, another image in which collage, the method of building the image is a kind of collage, but everything is reliant on these sort of trespassing these assumptions around how painting or modernist painting operates. There's no illusion, there's no cavity. This idea of the raw canvas, which is behind this sort of funny tongue thing, being the back of the painting that you can reach back and kind of touch. And in the meantime, there's all this stuff happening in front, which is very shallow. I think these are amazing. I guess part of my main revelation in the last couple weeks has been this idea that maybe intuition is real. It's like there's a part that goes on in the studio where you're, you know, it's the 10% where you're in your little dance trance and you're not thinking about what's going on. And up until the last 5 years or so, I've thought, well, it's basically because I have these gestures in my body. It's like being an athlete, and I'm sort of conditioned. So I'll just, you know, that's what happens when I start working. But actually, I think it's just much more complicated than that. I think the thing that I'm really appreciating about him and the stuff that I'm looking at around his work is the notion that, and this is not going to come as a surprise to anyone, you know, this sort of connection between the intellect and body, experience, feeling, the way that we actually move in the studio and as we're looking at things. Couple more images. The other thing I am so interested in with Motherwell is his titles and the sort of literary allusions, the gestures towards other artists, the way that the titles become this whole other world in which we know so much about his work and where it's located. They're also extremely funny. I was just at the Met and saw this painting and I was like, wow, that's exactly how Americans feel when they go to Paris. It's like, yes, you're wearing your puffer coat and your sneakers. So I too am very interested in these kind of titles. To me, calling something untitled feels like I'm missing this opportunity to create a kind of parallel, this is a terrible word, but sort of like aura, or, you know, something that goes next to the painting, where you're getting sort of images in your mind in terms of what you might see there. So this painting is 72 or 80 inches, so it's quite large. The thing you're not seeing in these paintings is the fact that the surfaces are incredibly worked over. So this black shape in the corner is kind of gritty. And in terms of surrealism, I have been extremely interested in, especially Max Ernst, this idea of these kind of tactile surfaces that separate and are used throughout the pictures to evoke some kind of touch or evoke kinds of illusions or illusions. And one thing for me with acrylic paint is that it's sort of endlessly fascinating in that way. You can just keep milking it, and probably because it doesn't have a very long history. But so it's not like oil paint where you're like, oh, Titian did that. It's this sort of narrow band. These are the last couple paintings I'll show. I'm going to be having a show at DC Moore in February, so these are some new paintings. And I've switched to using, I've also added flash to my studio practice, which is this vinyl paint that's incredibly flat. So there's a kind of relationship between the glossy and the extremely matte, sort of color-absorbing flash. And I just wanted to finish with one piece of writing that Motherwell did on Jackson Pollock in relation to my interest in the idea of movement. He wrote something on Pollock called animated rhythm. Okay, here we go. People were likely to mix up Pollock's character with his painting. An explosive character, it's true, a landmine, seemingly like Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire. And that sullen, socially inarticulate character was projected by others onto his paintings. But in the studio, Pollock was wholly articulate, with his body, arm, wrist, eye, dancing over the canvas on the floor. What might have seemed at the time brutal, a war dance, now seems to me sheer lyricism. His painting dance is highly ordered, naturally so. When a human being does something with great intensity, he instinctively orders it. In modern physics, the firm Newtonian sense of order has not held sway for a long time, and more recently, scientists have been searching for patterns that can be found in seeming chaos. Pollock had, no doubt, unknowingly, a sense of order, much more in line with modern physics. His work is organic without artifice, shattering all that is solid. So that was from 1984. Thank you.